Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special webinar on AB 1468, the new ethnic studies bill in the state of California. My name is Dylan Hosier. I'm the CEO at ICANN, and joining me is Nicole Bernstein from Peer K-12. Thank you, Nicole, for joining me here this evening.
Thank you for having me. Very interesting, hot topic we have tonight.
Absolutely. So first of all, just some ground rules, some housekeeping stuff before we start. The recording, as usual, will be made available after the webinar. We actually are broadcasting live also on our channels on YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook, and also on X. If you have questions, please go ahead and ask wherever you are. You may be watching in our live webinar room. You can ask the questions there as well. This is kind of a new setup for us, so bear with us while we get through this webinar, but I hope it'll be a good experience for all of you. With that in mind, if you do have questions or comments about the topic, please be polite and diplomatic. I know that not all of us may agree on this issue. However, I do want to draw a line at material or conversations around Israel and any controversies that you may feel about Israel. That won't be tolerated. We're not interested in talking about that during this webinar. So we'd ask you to take that elsewhere. And if you don't take it elsewhere, then we will help you take it elsewhere. Nicole will actually help me help. So anyway, feel free to ask questions. Nicole, if you see interesting questions that relate to the topic that we're talking about on the screen at the moment, please feel free to pop them up on the screen, and I'll do my best to read them, or you can tell me what they are.
Absolutely.
Cool. Thank you so much. And then, so one other thing I did want to tell you before we jump in is that this is a long presentation. So please bear with us. We want to go very much in depth with you about this topic so that you're educated fully about the topic of this bill specifically and ethnic studies generally. And hopefully you can pass the word to your friends and colleagues about this issue, being better educated and made aware about all of the issues. So before we jump in, Nicole, have I forgotten anything so far?
No, I think we're good to go. I think as the questions roll in again, if Dylan doesn't cover the question, I will be sure to chime in so that we can make sure to address any of those open issues.
And for everybody watching, yes, this is recorded. It's recording now. Immediately when we end the stream, the recording will be available on our YouTube, LinkedIn, X, Facebook, everywhere. So you should be able to find it there. Also, when you go to your email where you signed up and signed in, the links will be available for you there as well. All right. So with no further ado, let's see if we can get this presentation going. Stand by. All right. Is that a good setup, Nicole?
Looks good.
Perfect. Excellent. So the topic of today's webinar is ethnic studies or exclusion studies, what California's newest K-12 ethnic studies bill gets wrong. Today, we're going to do a little bit of an AB 1468 fact check. First, I'll introduce myself just to kind of give you some background on my policy work and other kind of government work I've done. Then once we dive into the substantive topic of this webinar, we'll go through 5 key areas. The first being, what is multicultural education versus ethnic studies? It's a key difference, and I think that we need to understand these technical differences. Number 2, how we got here, and an AB 1468 overview. So how did we get here from a legislative history standpoint regarding ethnic studies and multicultural education? And then we will go over a AB 1468 overview. We'll look at existing code and where there are gaps. Nobody here is suggesting that the law is perfect and that the current system is perfect. Far from it, actually. So we will discuss some of those gaps, but some existing law that is applicable as well. We'll talk then very quickly about the legislative process and calendar, and then I'll show you a little QR code at the end that you can use to take next steps. All right, so with that, I think we will go ahead and dive in. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dylan Hosier. I have spent over 20 years in public policy, specifically working in American politics, Congress, legislative process, but also international law, international relations, and international security policy. I have spoken at The Hague on European security policy. I spent 10 years at the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is like the Israeli version of our State Department in the United States. And I was posted here at the consulate in Los Angeles, and I served in the role of political officer in that mission. Our region stretched all the way from Hawaii up to Wyoming. And in that capacity, my job was to maintain the political and diplomatic relationship between the United States and Israel, and worked on many different items, especially Iran sanctions, and helped many California leaders back in around the 2010, 2011 time, help build California's Iran sanctions regime, and then, of course, worked on some anti-BDS policies. My most proud moment so far, I guess, is being the architect and co-author of the California-Israel MOU, which was signed by Governor Brown and Prime Minister Netanyahu back in 2014. I also more recently worked on key legislation here in California. We're very proud to have sponsored the Commission on the State of Hate bill, AB 1126, which of course recently came out with their annual report, raising serious questions about ethnic studies and its effect on student prejudice. So that's my background. Here are some pictures of me in various capacities, in case you don't believe me. Here's, of course, President Shimon Peres, John McCain, the Prime Minister, and Governor Brown, who, when they came to California to sign that agreement, that was a really phenomenal thing. If you're not familiar with that agreement, I highly encourage you to look that up. So that's my background. I have worked on policy and legislation at every level of government, federal, state, and local, in many different jurisdictions, not just here in California, but also in different states across the country. So very familiar with different procedures and processes, and also different bills on this related issue. So in this first section here, I really want to go over what is multicultural education versus ethnic studies. These are two educational approaches, and they both touch on how we teach about culture, identity, and history. In California classrooms, students learn about culture and identity in different ways. These two approaches have kind of emerged over the past decade or so, but they're not the same. Multicultural education and ethnic studies both deal with race and identity, as well as inclusion, but they come at it from different traditions with different goals. And understanding this difference helps us ask what kind of classroom we want. So when we look at multicultural education, we're looking at something that celebrates diversity and it builds belonging. Multicultural education seeks to include everyone through stories of shared history, diverse contributions, and civic values. It welcomes many cultural voices into shared narratives, encourages empathy, respect, and belonging. It highlights how people from all backgrounds shape society and teaches students to live together in a diverse democracy. However, ethnic studies is very different. Ethnic studies looks at history through the lens of struggle, focusing on power, injustice, and lived experience of marginalized groups. This prioritizes four racial and ethnic groups in particular, from the African American, Latino Chicano, Native American, and Asian American groups. This area of education focuses on oppression and colonization, and also resistance and forms of resistance. It talks about identity and activism, as well as social justice. And it actively encourages students to challenge systems to build a, quote, more equitable future. And of course, all of these terms are defined in what and I think probably most Californians would consider radical terms. So there you can see the difference between the two. These are not just two versions of the same thing. And I think that's what a lot of people are confused about with regard to ethnic studies. Of course, we want multicultural education. We want to learn about people's shared experiences, but that's not what ethnic studies is. And to use these terms interchangeably is a mistake. And it's a mistake because our opponents are not using those terms interchangeably. When we say ethnic studies, they say, yes, ethnic studies, that's great. This is what ethnic studies is. And we know, by the way, that it's different from multicultural education because the California Education Code actually historically shows these differences over time. And we'll go through that more tonight. This is a slide from a liberated ethnic studies activist named Teresa Montano. And she herself, in her slide, shows that ethnic studies is not DEI, and here or multicultural education rather. And I know DEI is in controversial spaces now, in controversial conversations. We may have different views on that, but in terms of the multicultural education side of things, this slide from Teresa really explains and shows how the two are different. And by the way, just so that people understand who this person is who made this slide, Teresa Montano is one of the key architects of the original liberated ethnic studies model curriculum that was thrown out by the governor and the legislature, and who has since gone on to build the Liberated Ethnic Studies Coalition that has been pushing a lot of the fringe radical versions of ethnic studies throughout the state. So again, these are the people who are teaching. And by the way, Teresa Montano serves as a commissioner on the LA County Board of Education or Office of Education as an appointed member. So this isn't a person who doesn't have their hands in education policy. This is someone who's helping to build policy at the local level. I happen to be based in LA County. So I'm familiar with this activism, and it hits at the most populous county in the state. Can
I just add one more thing about Teresa Montano is that she also sits on the Instructional Quality Commission. And I think that is something that's going to be important as you get kind of farther into the details of 1468. But this is a person who is generally considered one of the most expert level practitioners of real ethnic studies, which you were describing here. But I just wanted to throw that in. The Instructional Quality Commission is also a really important piece for the conversation later on.
Thank you. Absolutely. Oh, let's see, go back. All right, how we got here, and an AB 1468 overview. I warn you in advance, this is a long section, it's a long history, so bear with me. And again, Nicole, please interrupt me if I'm either drifting or boring or not on track otherwise, so I appreciate that.
We're going to have a quiz later, so everyone pay attention.
Absolutely. So when we look at multicultural education versus ethnic studies, and then when we think about the problems that we're seeing in our public schools and in our classrooms, much of which stems from ethnic studies, where the ethnic studies teachers, you kind of, step back and you say, gosh, what do we need? If only we had a law where we could make sure that students learned about diverse communities. If we only had a law that required schools to include the true contributions of Americans from all backgrounds in a fair and unbiased way. We only had a law that banned discrimination in textbooks and also in instruction and instructional materials. And then also protected all students no matter their background. So what's interesting is we know, and these are just 4 quick bullets, but these are things that I think we would all like to have. And in fact, proponents of AB 1468 claim that this bill, that AB 1468, will put new ethnic studies standards and guardrails in place that prohibit liberated ethnic studies, and then would give us, quote unquote, real ethnic studies, which is actually multicultural education, right? That's the basis of the arguments and that the proponents are making. And they argue that once AB 1468 actually passes into law, that we will have a law which does at least these 4 things, if not more. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to something called the Fair Education Act, which was a bill passed and signed into law back in 2011. FAIR, in this case, stands for Fair, Accurate, Inclusive, and Respectful Education, the Fair Education Act. It was sponsored by I believe it was Senator Leno back in, as I said, 2011. And actually, the sponsor of the bill, the sponsoring organization in this sense, was Equality California. And as Zabur mentioned recently in his broadcast, he was the executive director at that time and worked on this bill. As I said, it was enacted in 2011, signed into law that mid-July, and it is in effect statewide. It applies to all schools, including charter and alternative schools. And of course, the focus area is on working in the social sciences and enhancing the instructional materials. And what this bill did, the most relevant section that this bill amended is the following. It reads, instruction in social sciences shall include the role and contributions of Native Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, European Americans, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans, persons with disabilities, and members of other ethnic and cultural groups. That is in the law right now. Here are a few other things that the bill also provided. One, no biased instruction or activities. Teachers and schools may not promote discriminatory bias. And of course, this applies to race, ethnicity, gender, religion, disability, nationality, sexual orientation, and others. And of course, this is covered in that Ed Code as shown on the screen. Number two, no biased or disparaging materials. Textbooks and resources cannot reflect negatively on any group and applies to all adopted materials in public schools. This is covered in the following Ed Codes there on the screen. Number three, the curriculum must be inclusive and accurate. Schools must teach the contributions of many groups, including those listed: African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, as I said before, the list. I will say that this legislation added European Americans, LGBT Americans, and persons with disabilities. So again, if we're concerned about some groups being left out, then we have a model where through this fair education framework, other groups of peoples were added. So that's number three with the Fair Education Act. Number four, it applies to all public schools. This includes charter and alternative schools. No school is exempt from these protections. And also, very importantly, the Fair Education Act prohibits sectarian or ideological indoctrination. That means instructional materials must be free of religious doctrine or other ideological propaganda that we see. And by the way, I would want to ask here, when we think about this, and we look through these 5 features of the Fair Education Act, which, by the way, again, has been on the books since 2011, I think we should start asking ourselves, is the ethnic studies model curriculum as passed into law and approved by the Board of Education compatible, fundamentally compatible with these aspects of the law? I would argue probably not. So when we look at the ethnic studies legislative journey, we can see over the years the different bills that have been passed or proposed, starting in 2011 with, as I said, the Fair Education Act, SB 48, which again established a lot of the guardrails and the kind of the multicultural education that we're all looking for. But then in 2016, and we'll go through each of these steps. This is kind of a quick overview. In 2016, AB 2016, again, the number and the year happened to match. This is the bill that established the ethnic studies model curriculum that then came out and was so extreme and radical and had to be changed. Then you fast forward to 2021, and you had the ethnic studies graduation mandate bill, and that also seeked to put some guardrails in. And then, of course, this year, 2025, we have AB 1468, which seeks to establish standards and a framework. I want you to look very carefully at this because I want you to think again about the legislative and policy history of this issue. What started in 2011 under the Fair Education Act, which I think is an example of what we all want to see in multicultural education, has very clearly progressed along a very specific path where a curriculum was established in 2016, the graduation mandate was passed in 2021. Even if it's not funded now, it was still passed into law and it could be funded at any time. And then, of course, we have this new model, which seeks to put more guardrails in, and it seeks to satisfy our community's needs by adding those guardrails, but at the same time, it adds ethnic studies standards and a framework which would take what is already problematic in the model curriculum and elevate it to the level of a core area of education within our California public schools. That means that ethnic studies would essentially be as important as math, science, history, English, and so on. And again, when you look at what ethnic studies is, or think about what ethnic studies is versus multicultural education, which we already have, what will these new standards and what will this framework look like? And we'll be asking that question throughout this presentation. How am I doing, Nicole? Is it okay?
Doing great. Although I want to make one correction on something that I said, which was fact checked by one of the viewers, and I really appreciate that. So Teresa Montano is not currently on the IQC. So I appreciate that fact check in real time. Thank you so much. She was on previously. She is no longer. Although, again, as Dylan mentioned, she holds very high roles in Los Angeles at the County Board of Ed there. And, again, she is considered one of the foremost experts in ethnic studies. So thank you for that comment. And I stand corrected.
Cool. Very good. All right. So, and again, just this is a complicated story, so we really want to make sure that everybody's picking up the how this issue evolved over time. So, how did we go from multicultural to ideological? Again, where did we start? SB 48 2011 required teaching about many cultural, racial, and identity groups, focused on shared history and diverse contributions in preventing bias. Applies to all schools. It was built for unity and inclusion, and it gave clear legal guardrails, no discrimination, no bias, and no ideological content. So what changed? Once we skipped ahead to AB 2016, this legislation required the creation of a model curriculum in ethnic studies, but very importantly, it did not define what ethnic studies meant in the law. And actually, when you read the bill and looked at the legislative language, there are no 4 core priority ethnic groups mentioned. There's no ethnic groups mentioned at all. It really looks like an extension of SB 48, that multicultural education that was created and meant to be embedded in all aspects of social studies was going to get its own curriculum, but again, within that existing history and social studies framework. That's what it looked like at the time.
And I believe did not get bipartisan support.
It did get bipartisan support, absolutely.
Right? I mean, this was
100%.
something that everyone felt was absolutely something that we all wanted. This was not a partisan issue at that time, before that model curriculum, the first version, was released to the public.
Absolutely. Correct. So, right. So this is AB 2016, happened to be also the year 2016. It's about 3 full years before the model curriculum is actually released. And that, by the way, is when Montano was on the curriculum, the IQC and the curriculum advisory committee. Yeah. So the last bullet here is that it left implementation to a team, and this is where we're talking about Teresa, rooted in college ethnic studies departments, not traditional K-12 civics. And there were many people at that time who were raising, red flags and the alarm about this that, by the way, myself included, did not pay adequate enough attention to. So that's AB 2016 was the real first departure from what we would consider multicultural education. So what happened next? In 2019, the first draft was released. And again, the people who made up that commission were college and faculty and activists, frankly. This first draft was wild. For those of you who may remember it, even the LA Times came out in opposition. That's how extreme it was. But it really emphasized settler colonialism, white supremacy, empire, resistance. In some cases, it promoted violent resistance. It highlighted and celebrated liberation and revolutionary figures. And there was explicit support for the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel. Of course, it excluded Jewish Americans, including Israeli Americans and other immigrant Jewish communities, as well as, of course, Armenian communities and other communities. It ignored anti-Semitism while focusing heavily on every other form of hate, by the way. This ethnic studies draft curriculum, again, was released in the summer of 2019, and it was one of the most radical things I've ever seen a government produce, if not the most radical. From 2020 to 2021, there were multiple rewrites of the draft curriculum. Jewish organizations, including us, Armenian groups, and others sounded the alarm. Lawmakers, again, across party lines, condemned that draft curriculum. At the time, Governor Newsom said, quote, that it would never see the light of day, and he made sure that he worked with the appropriate branches and departments to make sure that happened. Throughout the process, there were about 100,000 public comments submitted that opposed that draft. As a result of that advocacy, there were a few things that changed. First, some of the most overt bias was removed. So the pro-BDS stuff, I believe, not just the negative mentions of Israel, but I believe every mention of Israel was removed. There are some Jewish elements now to the curriculum that were submitted by community members, but problematically, the underlying framework, and again, this is something even I at the time did not understand, the underlying framework is completely rooted in oppressor activist ideology, and that is still there. If you pull up the ethnic studies model curriculum today, you will see terms like transformative resistance and radical healing and calls to fight the cis heteropatriarchy, and all sorts of interesting other radical terminology and topics. So now that curriculum, unfortunately, that was approved back in 2021, is used as a reference point for ethnic studies statewide. And in fact, it's used as a reference point in 1468 as well.
I think that's actually one of the things that is most difficult for parents. We work with a lot of parents on the ground in different school districts, and that is one of the hardest things to push back on, is because you'll see content showing up in school districts and that is pretty bad, and we will request that it be removed or changed, and the district administrators will say, well, we took this directly from the model curriculum, so it's good to go. And I think that's the biggest misconception, is that even if you weren't, wonky enough to really understand all the ins and outs of the original draft, the illusion that it was revamped and redone somehow to be okay is actually false. They simply removed some of the really, really bad stuff, the most egregious, and then everything else is still in there. And even though none of the districts had to use anything from the model curriculum, many of them did. And many of them used material that was still pretty awful. So that's been one of the biggest challenges, actually, that it's sort of been mainstreamed and it's part of the model curriculum at state level. So why wouldn't we use it here in our district?
Agreed. It's become the gold standard of ethnic studies in California, unfortunately. Okay, so now moving on to what is AB 101, and this is the bill that I refer to as the Mandatory Ethnic Studies Bill. What this bill requires is that all high schools must offer an ethnic studies course by 2025 and 2026. The graduation requirement, if funded, would start with the class of 2029 to 2030. And this, of course, applies to all public and charter schools statewide. Courses that would meet this requirement can use, again, the model curriculum, existing A through G approved courses. Those are in the existing social history and social studies English requirements, or locally developed courses. And I really want to emphasize here that when we look at what courses can use, there's nothing here that says that these courses should be developed outside of any standard or framework. These A through G approved courses have existing standards. Locally developed courses should fall within those standards as well and must be board approved. The model curriculum is a little bit of a wild card, in my opinion. Again, I think there are questions as to whether what it is exactly fully fits within the rest of the ed code or is fully compatible with the rest of the ed code. But nonetheless, to suggest that these ethnic studies courses are being taught outside of current standards, I don't believe is entirely accurate to say. And I'm being polite when I say that. So what's missing from AB 101? Ethnic studies, once again, still is not defined in law. And I do want to emphasize that this bill also does not mention the 4 core or priority ethnicities. The model curriculum, however, in this bill really does kind of enshrine itself as the default, even though it still is controversial. And again, at the time, if you Google my name in AB 101, you will see a very supportive op-ed of this piece of legislation. Because at the time we were sold that this bill has guardrails that will turn ethnic studies essentially into multicultural education. So
you're the only one who believed the false advertising, the nice package that once you unwrap it, you realize is a big lump of coal. We all kind of fell for it. Like we all thought the guardrails would really protect us and protect the students, but.
Well, and I think that, if people wonder why, for me, why I'm so passionate about my position now is because I went through this. We went through this already. We did this. We did AB 1468 already. We did it back with AB 101. And what's interesting to me is when you look at looking at AB 101 and kind of stepping back and looking at the elements of what this bill actually is. It is 2 main components. One, it is the graduation mandate, which people were concerned about. But in order to get that graduation mandate, the proponents of ethnic studies had to, quote, give up guardrails. So there were guardrails to ethnic studies that were added to AB 101. But in exchange for those guardrails, we had to accept a graduation mandate. And at the end of the bill, there's a funding trigger that says that this statute is only applicable or active when it is funded. Now, there were questions for years about whether or not there had been an appropriation to this line item, or to this specific item rather. And for years, I'd ask people, and people gave different answers. I'm not sure it's entirely 100% clear even today, but the preponderance of evidence and even the California Department of Finance, it seems to indicate that this statute is not funded and that there was not an appropriation given to this piece of legislation. Now, many of us are happy about that because it does not, that means the graduation mandate is not in effect. So that's a great thing for those of us who are leery or concerned about ethnic studies. That graduation mandate, according to the law now and the lack of funding, is not active. But if you talk to proponents of AB 1468, what also is not active is the guardrail that was added to that piece of legislation. So now as a selling point to AB 1468, they're saying that AB 1468 actually reactivates and puts in stronger guardrails because AB 101 was never funded. So while on the one hand, and I'll get to in a second, but I just want to make this one point because I think it's important to ask, which is, okay, it's great that the ethnic studies mandate was never funded, but what was the legislature thinking in terms of never funding the guardrail if they were really adamant about protecting those classes and that issue in the first place? So I think we have to look at both sides of that equation and understand that we were let down. I'm sorry to say, but we were let down from that standpoint. Now, the good news is that the argument that I'm making tonight is that we already have guardrails in place. SB 48 provides all the necessary framework that we need. If I had known at the time, if I had done my homework better at the time with AB 101, I would have seen that that was a redundancy and we should have opposed it. And there were others who did oppose it at the time, and they were right. I was wrong. But I think it's important to see, again, how we're simply rehashing that same argument that we went through already with AB 101, now with 1468. Nicole, sorry.
Yeah, no, I actually totally agree. And I think this is, this is where things really do get complicated, is that the guardrails are there really as recommendations. It is the intent of the legislature that school district not use any of the biased, material that was removed, right? And it's like, great, who's in charge of monitoring that and enforcing it? And unfortunately, what happened was the Wild West, and it fell on parents to be monitoring every single detail that was coming out of school districts and content and curriculum development. And suddenly new classes were popping up as pilots. And if it's a pilot class, then it doesn't fall under the same jurisdiction as the transparency clause for a general curriculum, which, by the way, also exists already. We don't have to have a whole nother thing to talk about, it must be transparent. We've got that already in Ed Code. None of it was happening. And so what you had was parents scrambling, trying to learn all of this stuff on the fly as we were trying to protect our kids, and really not getting any backing for the enforcement piece of it. And I think that's where, neither AB 101 or 1468 really helps parents in that area. It's, the intent of the legislature that bad things not be taught to kids. Great. How do you enforce it? Who's enforcing it? When parents submit complaints, to their districts, or complaints to the state, or complaints to the OCR, who's monitoring that? Who's enforcing it? So that, again, it was, they put it out there and they sort of just hoped that everybody would do the right thing. And unfortunately, you can put together a speed limit and you can put up signs, but unless you've got someone there enforcing the speed limit, probably not going to have every single district really following it. So that was a big miss.
Yep. Agreed. Good point. All right. So you kind of, you led us right into this. So what happened after AB 101 passed? As Nicole said, districts began rolling out these courses, but many schools rushed to create or adopt. You said this already, Nicole. I don't mean to rehash.
I didn't even know that this was the next slide.
We didn't practice this. So many relied on the model curriculum as their blueprint. Others hired outside consultants. That includes the liberated ethnic studies folks, or they developed their own materials. Either way, the content varied widely with little, I would say, very little oversight or vetting. What happened after AB 101 passed further? Again, as Nicole reiterated, there were growing concerns, reports of courses promoting, of course, anti-Israel or anti-Semitic content. The oppressor-oppressed framework was labeling students from all backgrounds and all communities. And there were lessons on resistance and liberation rather than shared civic values. So if you know the stories of the districts in Santa Ana or Palo Alto, there were major problems there. These problems are ongoing, and of course, Berkeley as well. Unfortunately, what we have seen since AB 101 passed is that the state has stayed out of this in large measure. There has been some interaction with the state of California, but primarily it has fallen onto the community to take districts to court in order to enforce and interpret the law. So we have seen several lawsuits and other sorts of controversies across the state, and this is ongoing. And again, we featured in our ethnic studies forum a couple weeks ago or a month ago the situation in Palo Alto, which is pretty extreme. So it's really this whole thing is tearing the state apart, frankly. And again, one of the things that we began to see after AB 101 is that there is no system to review or approve course content. There's no accountability for outside contractors. And again, communities like the Jewish, Armenian, and others were still left excluded. And this promise of ethnic studies for all never happened. And I would encourage you, by the way, to go back, Google AB 101, and look at the Jewish Caucus press release from September of 2021 that celebrates passage of this bill, and that it will be ethnic studies for all. And it's amazing. You can imagine that if 1468 were to pass, that I don't know what other language they would use except for exactly what they wrote 5 years ago for the same issue. So what I want to know, and what we should all be asking, is what happened? What happened between then and now, besides the fact that the mandate and the guardrails were not funded? What else happened? Was there an oversight hearing? Was the superintendent of public instruction issuing compliance audits throughout the state of California? What do we know? What do we not know? What is the Attorney General doing? The Attorney General, as we'll get to later, issued a legal alert. What happened with that legal alert? So the AB 101, just in the interim between then and now, the problems just got even worse when they were supposed to be made better by this bill. As I mentioned, the Attorney General submitted or issued, I should say, a legal note to every school district in the state of California, and charter schools as well. This legal note is incredibly important because it reaffirmed that existing law already prohibits bias in ethnic studies, and that it requires inclusive, accurate, and balanced instruction for all student communities. But the alert also acknowledged that schools are not complying and that oversight is failing. So again, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, we do have a lot of laws and tools to use in the current Ed Code, but there are some gaps, and oversight and enforcement, as Nicole had said previously, are major areas of improvement, of needed improvement. This is just, I would recommend, if you'd like to take a screenshot of this, these are issues that the Attorney General brought up in his legal note, and these are the accompanying statutes that are related. I'll give it a second. Or if Nicole, you want to say something?
I do, yeah. And again, this is really interesting. So this is something that we dive into a lot when we do our advocacy to school boards, when we do have parents who come to us from various districts with issues, and we go to these Ed codes and we submit them to school board trustees, and we say, hey, this content that was put out, or this newsletter that was put out, or this lesson plan, or this, whatever assignment violates one or all of these Ed codes. Please investigate. Please make sure that it is removed from the classroom, and that this issue is fixed. And almost every time that happens, they look at it and they say, I mean, we even have one school board member who said on the dais, on the record, that these codes and the guardrails they're not enshrined in law. They're parameters that they sort of are suggested to stay within, which is not true. This is law, and it should be enforced. And in fact, you did see one or two examples of school districts having some oversight in a completely different area, pretty immediate. But again, it was a very partisan issue. And so we know that the state can act on some violation of some sorts, but for I've actually never heard of a single school district where you had a violation in one of these areas and it was followed up by at the Attorney General level. It just doesn't happen with ethnic studies, and it certainly doesn't happen when the victims are Jews or Israelis, or perceived as being Jewish or Israeli.
Yeah, agreed. It's a huge issue, and I think that again, when we look at all of the time that we're spending on now a piece of legislation, we should also be asking ourselves, what time are we spending to ensure that these statutes are being adhered to, and that the Attorney General is helping to ensure that compliance.
Yeah.
All right. All right. So that takes us right to 1468. So this is the current ethnic studies bill that is being considered this year. It has been introduced by Assembly members Zabur and Adis. It is co-sponsored by every member of the Jewish caucus, and there are several other members outside of the Jewish caucus. There's a handful from the Latino caucus, a couple from the, I believe, the Women's Caucus and the Progressive Caucus. Maybe I'll after I talk about the introduction, Nicole, I want to talk a little bit about process. I didn't include process in this presentation, but I want to touch on it before we move on from this slide. So I'll circle back to that. Okay. But what this bill proposes is statewide ethnic studies content standards that should be put in place by 2028. It requires the adoption of official curriculum frameworks and instructional materials, and it requires districts to submit their ethnic studies courses and materials to the state. So a few things, and there's also an advisory committee in the current version of the bill, which would include four priority ethnic studies discipline areas. So that's African American, Latino and Chicano, Native American, and Asian American and Pacific Islander. Just to pause on this point, there is chatter in the community that this particular provision of the bill has been removed. We'll see it. I have no reason to doubt the people who have said this, but we'll see it when we see it. So just to note that I will not spend too much time on that particular clause, except to say that of the bills that we had seen previously, all of the ethnic studies bills historically, this is the first ethnic studies piece of legislation related to K-12 at least, that in the operative legislative language includes the four priority or core ethnicities. And in my mind, when I look at that as a person who has worked with this legislature for many, many, many years and worked in many different jurisdictions, and understanding the controversy and confusion around what is ethnic studies versus what is multicultural education, when I see this reference to these four core or these four priority ethnicities, that tells me that the authors of this bill are referencing the ideologically driven oppressor-oppressed framework version of ethnic studies. I don't know whether they know they're doing that or not, but when I look at this as somebody who has had concerns and confusion around the terms and what it is that we're trying to achieve at the end of the day, this edition raised a lot of red flags for me. If it's been excluded, that's fine. Its initial inclusion indicates to me that the authors may not fully grasp the full scope of what ethnic studies can be to activists who happen to also be in education.
Yeah, so it's interesting because this specific part of it, I think, also raised a lot of eyebrows in both the sort of the two camps that you would never expect would be in line with each other in opposition of an area of the bill. And by this, I mean, you've got the purist ethnic studies, the practitioners, the experts, the people who have PhDs in ethnic studies. They saw this, even though it is, if you look at any of their materials, it will say this, but what they saw was you're trying to force us not to speak about Palestinians and not to speak about Arab Americans. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the Jewish and Israeli community, parents, grassroots, that said, wait a second, all of that work that went in to AB 101 to at least get some positive stories and histories and content about the Jewish American experience, and especially, Jewish America, or the Jewish experience from the Middle East and North Africa, from Jemena, was summarily removed. And so, it's almost like yeah, we're going to have to do the whole thing all over again if this hasn't been removed. But at the same time, it's actually all that work that did go into actually getting something in has been removed. So it was a very weird situation where when this bill came out, you had the two groups that generally were in total opposition to each other actually agreeing on something, which was an awkward and weird situation to be in. But, again, I don't know if the authors thought that maybe they could curb some of the anti-Israel sentiment and rhetoric and content by excluding both the Jewish and the Arab American stories from ethnic studies. I don't know if they thought people would just let that go, but that was a weird that was a weird point when this came out. It was, as you said, are they just picking things directly from their critical ethnic studies, the liberal ethnic studies materials? Were they trying to maybe curb some of the negative content about Israel and the Jewish community by excluding Arab Americans, and thus also having to exclude the Jewish Americans? It just kind of made a mess. So that was an interesting piece of when this first came out, and we all started looking at it from all angles.
Yeah, and you do bring up a good point about what the author's intent at the end of the day, and I think that, look, I don't besmirch the authors. I don't think they have ill will toward the Jewish community, but I think that in this case, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, somebody did not do their homework, because this proposed fix is not a fix. It's rehashing something we've already done, and it actually adds to the problem again, because a term like a standard and a framework sounds like we're going to put real strong guardrails in place now. It's a standard and it's a framework. But actually what that is, it's an expansion of ethnic studies beyond the history and social studies framework that it currently is in. And it simply adds this ideological and oppression framework to a new level. Again, as I said, on par with math, science, and history and English and everything else. And I think that's incredibly dangerous to be doing in our public schools, especially for K through 12 aged students.
I mean, again, it is what the real practitioners of ethnic studies actually want. I mean, they want everything to be taught through the lens of critical ethnic studies. So they don't want necessarily just, ethnic studies to be off on its own with its own content standards. They actually do want it to be in everything. They want critical ethnic math, critical ethnic, like they want everything to be taught through this lens. And so it's an interesting thing. I personally, I guess off the record as we can be here, I think the authors of the bill were really trying to figure out a way to right some of the wrongs that they sort of maybe overlooked, or maybe were hoping that would be okay, but realized after the fact that it really wasn't. But I think in trying to solve one or two of those issues, they actually sort of opened up a whole other sort of can of maybe 3 or 4 different cans of worms in the other direction, in a very unintended oops. And so I don't know how, again, if this part is removed, that could be interesting. Does that mean that they're also removing, there's supposed to be an additional piece of legislation that creates this advisory committee? Is that also going to be removed? So there's a lot of questions. And I think actually we did have a question about amendments to the bill. And so, I guess maybe this might be one of them. I don't know if you're anticipating any other amendments.
Give me just a second, and then let me close what the bill proposes, and then we could do the amendments question if you like.
Perfect.
If that works. So I did want to point out that just on this slide, there's an editing mistake. So this is the correct slide. And again, it's to create ethnic studies content standards based on the ESMC, to adopt curriculum frameworks, instructional materials based on the ESMC. Look at the ESMC. That's the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, ESMC.
It is critical ethnic studies model curriculum minus the worst of the worst lessons. That's it.
And, by the way, just on that point, I have a theory that, look, the people who drafted the draft ethnic studies model curriculum are not stupid people. And I almost think that they proposed something that was so extreme, so out there initially. And by the way, for those who aren't aware, when I say so extreme, so out there, they didn't even use the proper spellings of certain words, and it was intentional because they didn't want to highlight men or other people in certain contexts. So they spelled women with a Y rather than an E, and other things like that, which you know. I think that was not an accident, and I think that they took it to level, 10, and they were like, whoa, 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 that has to be changed. And so, okay, we took it down to 8.
Right.
Whereas if they had taken it to an 8, we'd have taken it to a 5, right?
Classic negotiation technique.
Very smart, very sharp people. The one aspect of the bill I neglected to include on the previous slide is that the districts are required to submit their ethnic studies courses and materials to the state. Very interestingly, though, the CDE by this statute is only required to conduct a review every 5 years of and to produce a report every 5 years of a selection of school districts in California on this issue of ethnic studies. That's every 5 years, a report on some districts and how they have implemented and how they're complying with ethnic studies related statute. Bear in mind that legislative term limits are 12 years. That means maximally in a legislator's legislative lifetime, they're going to see that report maybe twice, depending when it comes out and what their current situation is, whatever. Maximum twice. They won't see it more. So they will have 2 data points with which to legislate when they come in. I think that's insufficient for something that is so controversial. I wanted to mention it there because I think it's dishonest to not have it there, because I think, again, proponents are trying to do something. I just think that we need to understand that the Department of Education can right now conduct a study. They could have been doing it last year. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. And in fact, they should do it. That's one of the things we'll advise later on. But I did want to just, in fairness to the proponents and to the bill authors, they did have a nice requirement to add that course study material to the state. Go ahead.
So can I say that actually caught my attention as well? And so I went on to the Department of Education website, and this is already happening. And they are doing sort of, these are the districts, that we will be reviewing. And there's apparently a report that is created. And I clicked on, all of those links click into a page, and then you click into another page and into another page. And then there's this is the monitoring tool that you need to have a login. And so I said, okay, well, give me a login. So I submitted, this is a week ago, I submitted my email and a request to have a login as a parent of a student in the district that I would like to see the report. And I haven't heard back yet. And you can't see anything unless you have the proper login. And so I don't know who is managing that part of the website, who gets the requests for logins, who gets those reports. I have no idea. It's information that doesn't really seem to be available. And anytime you try to click through to find more, you get to another page with a few more links that link into the other pages that you just came from. And it's just one big sort of circle that you go around on the website. It's fascinating. If you want to waste a good couple of hours, it's a good spot to do it.
Yeah, those data sets that are accessible by login are clever ways to avoid public access to certain public
100%.
information. So just and by the way, that what you did is something that we all need to do, and I did the same kind of search, and I wanted to see what kind of compliance. We'll talk more about it in a second, but what kind of compliance audits are happening now through CDE and so on, or even what kind of oversight hearings are happening within the legislature. People forget that legislators do 2 key things. Our legislators in California, because of the term limit situation and the musical political chairs that everybody plays, our legislators think they only have one job, which is to legislate. But that's not the case. But they do that job. They do it very well, as we see here with 1468. They love producing bills. But the other thing that they're required to do is to conduct oversight. Because if they don't conduct oversight for us, for their constituents, How are they keeping the governor's office in check? How are they keeping the CDE in check or the attorney general in check? And actually, in my opinion, and again, this isn't a commentary on any specific legislator or constitutional officer in case of the attorney general or superintendent or the governor, but when we don't have that kind of oversight, because in this case, the attorney general and the superintendent of public instruction both used to be in the legislature. Both will soon be termed out, by the way. I think the AG has one more term, but I believe the superintendent is termed out. And I guarantee you there are some legislators who are looking at that seat and saying, hey, I want to be in that seat. And I would also like to not have too much oversight or consternation from the legislature. That's only natural. That's a natural political phenomenon. And it's an unfortunate byproduct of the politics of California, unfortunately.
Right. Well, not only was our attorney general here in California used to be on the other side in the state assembly. He was the assemblyman from Oakland, the school district in Oakland that had more than 40 Jewish families asked to be transferred out after a lot of the ethnic studies content and material started popping up, and after October 7th, when those students were harassed beyond repair and they had to leave the district. But he was also one of the original co-authors of the AB 2016 ethnic studies bill that created the mandate. So, again, like every time I find one of these little tidbits, I'm like, well, okay, the system is rigged against the parents and the students. I really, don't know how all the parents are expected to follow the rules, go by the procedures that all of our school districts are telling us that we have to follow. We submit everything in the way that we're told to submit it, and then it goes into some black hole and we never hear back. And that is one of the most frustrating things. Like, we just don't have anybody really looking out for our interests. And again, I'm all for teaching real history. I really want that, because if they did teach real history, then the vast majority of California students would know what really is going on in the world. And right now they don't. They get a version through a lens that is very specific, and that's a big problem. So again, when I find these little aha moments of, oh, the AG, what is he doing? He's not following up on any of the harassment cases for any of the Jewish or Israeli students. He used to be in the state legislature, and he co-authored the bill that is causing all of the trouble. Wow. Interesting.
And I will say, even Tony Thurmond, Tony Thurmond is the head of the Department of Education in California. He was also a member of the legislature. And again, I mean, no problem with him. Nice guy. The voting record in the legislature was fantastic. I don't know that I don't know enough about the performance of the department to judge his impact on it. But that's just to say that regardless of what he chooses to do next, he has to leave that seat, and that leaves an open seat. And that open seat creates incentive for everybody to be nice to one another, and to because there will be competition for that seat. Somebody will rise above the rest and will be ushered in, I'm sure. But unless something changes in California politics, but
well, maybe more parents need to start getting involved in those California politics to kind of,
please.
We need somebody who speaks for us to be there, to be looking out for our children and for our interests, because it clearly has not been happening.
So the other thing I want to mention, I mentioned process before, and I think this is a good time to talk about the process issues of 1468. You see on the screen now, obviously, what it fails to fix, and it doesn't strengthen enforcement at all. Really, again, it does. There was that piece of enforcement in there, but those powers exist now within CDE. There's nothing stopping the CDE from doing its duty. One of the things that I personally find very problematic, I hear chatter that things are changing or things are improving on the criticism I'm about to bring up, but that is that it bothers me that this is a Jewish caucus bill. It's confusing to me that the members of the Jewish caucus came together in a way that seems to be exclusive of other affinity caucuses, and to have put the bill together on behalf of the Jewish community really without consulting others. And certainly, by the way, if you look at the Jewish organizations that are currently signed up as proponents of the bill, all of them are from the American Jewish community. I believe there's maybe one organization there that reflects the immigrant Jewish communities that we have across the state. There are many Persians, many Israeli American organizations out there, and of course, many former Soviet Union, Russian Jewish organizations out there, and communities out there. And there are many grassroots community organizations out there as well that aren't part of the organized legacy organizations that are supporting this bill. And I think that when we talk about consultation, it's not just with the other affinity caucuses, but it's also among the diversity of the Jewish community itself. And I think that that's a huge missed opportunity here for legislators. This was a way, I think, to bring a lot of people together and to bring a lot of smart people in the room to maybe come up with a way to address this issue. And instead, what it looks like is we have a situation where again, what is the currency of a legislator? The currency of a legislator is a great legislative agenda, so they can go on to higher office or go on to another office, wherever the California musical chairs of politics takes them. And so in that sense, when you look at AB 1468 from the electoral lens, it seems to me that someone just wanted to be able to say, hey, we solved ethnic studies, rather than actually solving ethnic studies. Because I'm sorry to say that if our legislators really did want to solve ethnic studies, or were really concerned about ethnic studies, there would have been an oversight hearing. There would have been a field hearing. There would have been a district town hall. And by the way, there would have been a district town hall that wasn't moderated by people who are going to hide questions and not allow open conversation about the bill. And I think that's a huge gap. And again, I've worked with the Jewish caucus since before it even existed. I was working with legislators, but I worked with the caucus in those early days. We have come far astray from those early days, and it's a shame. And I hope that we can get back on track. But this bill really is, in this whole situation, really is an exemplification of the gap between the people who represent us and those of us here on the ground. Go ahead, Nicole.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, again, I think there is an assumption that the large organizations, because, they really feel like they have the big relationships at the state level, and, and they think that they have the good relationships at the local level as well. They really think they've got a clear understanding of what's going on. But I can tell you that when districts say this is what we're doing, and even when you have the most amazing school board and they pass and approve content that is actually fine and great and we don't have any issues, that doesn't mean that what is showing up inside classrooms isn't completely different or completely violates any of this. And so when students and parents stand up and say, I've got an issue, I've got a question, I've got a problem, immediately we are branded as problematic, as aggressive, as why are you making such a big deal out of something, and why don't you want real history to be taught? And that wasn't actually any of the problems that any of the parents that we've ever helped had an issue with. And I think there's this assumption, again, from the large legacy organizations who work together with the state legislators and people with very impressive titles, but they don't really understand what's going on the ground. And without that understanding in every single school district, and even within a school district, you can have one school site very different from another school site. There's no guarantees. And to not bring those of us who are on the ground into that conversation, it's such a huge missed opportunity. And, again, what we were sold as this is a way to bring everybody together has actually proven the exact opposite. I mean, every school board meeting I go to, it's like a this half of the room is them, and this half of the room is us, and it's us versus them, and everyone is angry at everyone else. And it's been sort of miserable having to stop our normal lives and show up at school board meetings to have these fights and conversations, because the powers that be aren't actually taking the time to listen to us and what's happening to us and our children. And I think that again, I do believe that the Jewish caucus wanted to solve these issues. I just feel that they went about it in a way that doesn't include the people who are actually affected by these issues.
100%.
And I don't really understand why. So.
Yeah. Agreed. Fully agreed. And again, while I do think that they wanted to solve the problem, I don't know what incentivizes a legislator to say, hey, but by the way, if you don't want to have an in-person town hall, have a Zoom town hall. If you don't have a Zoom town hall, have a telephone town hall. Brad Sherman still has telephone town halls. God love him, in the San Fernando Valley. So, and those of you from the Jewish caucus in the San Fernando Valley know that he does that. You need to talk to the constituents, because the people on the ground don't understand what's happening. Their children are being hurt by it. And we really need real solutions, not lawmaking that makes it look like we're creating a solution while not performing oversight, which is a key function of a legislator, is to perform oversight and to make sure that current laws are being enforced.
And to be
Otherwise,
of the constituents. Yeah. Listen to what we're dealing with. We've got our legislators are supposed to be our representatives, are supposed to be our voice at that level to be there to express what's going on back home and try to find solutions. And by keeping us out of that process, I appreciate how much work they're doing on creating these, bills, but it doesn't actually solve the problem. So how much money and time and energy is being wasted now on something that doesn't actually do what they wanted it to do or what they hoped it would do? And it definitely doesn't help us on the ground, really in the immediate. I've got my son is going into 9th grade in the fall, in August, September, and what's going to happen, right? So that's a very immediate thing that people are feeling all over the state, and actually all over the country, because it's not just happening here in California, but definitely all over the state. And parents are frantic, frankly.
Yep. Agreed. So just to, we're almost done, guys. I know this was the biggest chunk in the presentation, but we're almost through. So again, I swear, Nicole and I did not practice this, but this is exactly what we're talking about. Yes, of course, there have been real problems. And, for those of you who are 1468 proponents, I hear you when you say that we need something. And I hear you when you say there are problems. Of course, we all see the problems. Yes, there has been bias in one-sided ethnic studies lessons. By the way, these are within the existing history and social studies standards. Some groups have been left out, while others have been misrepresented. And there is little clarity, except for when we hear complaints from our students or parents. There's little clarity on what's actually being taught. But again, these are, as we saw throughout this entire presentation, there's a long list of statutes that can impact these situations. These are not legal gaps. These are not law gaps. These are enforcement gaps. And one of the things that I would point you to is two pieces of legislation, one dead, one active. The one from last year was Henry Stern's SB 4, I believe it was SB 1421. I may not have that correct, but I think it was 1421, where this was the creation. This would have created an Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education. This was a bill, I think, that would have addressed a lot of the enforcement issues that we see. The bill actually made it through the policy committees in the Senate, and unfortunately died in the fiscal committee in the Senate. And it's not been reintroduced, unfortunately. AB 84 is a bill we'll talk about here in a second.
Actually, one second. There was a question that popped up that I'm going to kind of put in the forefront here, because I think it's a good question.
Oh, so Robert says, forgive my frustration. You guys seem really nice. It feels to me like you feel like ethnic studies is truly an awesome thing. if it could only be implemented correctly. This is a lot like DEI, which seems awesome until you figure out that it foments anti-Semitism. So just to Robert's point, if we weren't clear, I would urge you to go ahead and rewatch the beginning of the presentation, because actually I agree, and I think Nicole, I'm not speaking for her, agrees with you. Ethnic studies is not a good thing if it can be done correctly. Ethnic studies done correctly is still a bad thing. What we do approve of is, of course, the standard multicultural education that already exists within our public schools and has been there since 2011, and in fact was put in there primarily by the bill sponsor at the time, which was Equality California, who at the time was headed by Rick Sabur, who happens to be the same bill author of 1468. So I know he's familiar with the topic. I know he's very familiar with the topic. And so I think we just need to go back to his original framework rather than this new version that we have. So we agree with you.
Yeah, I just want to jump in as well and say I actually share your frustrations, because every time I get into a conversation about ethnic studies, inevitably somebody, gets angry at me and says, why don't you want real history to be taught?
That's the other side of the argument. That's when they're
And I say,
arguing
but
about
that's actually, so are we not teaching real history in history class? I've never actually seen any data that says that currently in California, we are not teaching real hard truths about our country's history in history classes. I've never seen any data towards that. And so again, when the argument comes in for ethnic studies that says, well, we have to teach the real truth and the hard truths, I'm like, well, I'm actually for teaching real history in history. Again, ethnic studies was created not to be a multicultural, kumbaya bringing us together. Ethnic studies is a very specific ideology that was created with a very specific goal, and bringing people together is not one of them. So, Robert, totally agree. I think, the nuance here for sure is, were the authors of AB 101 their intent, and how we go about pushing back on something like this, I think is also important. Because again, I always assume that people are trying to do the right thing, even elected officials, even politicians, even lawyers, right? But it's how, how are they coming up with a solution? Are they coming up with a solution based on what's actually happening on the ground? This case, no. Sorry, it wasn't. So thank you for that question. And I'm sorry I interrupted the whole presentation, but I thought that was really important to touch on in this moment.
No, that's good. Perfect. All right. So so just to carry on, and again, this is a very text heavy slide. Feel free to screenshot. I don't know if anybody has asked, I can't see the chat, but if I think we'll make this presentation available for download if people want it. But anyway, to carry on, no ideological indoctrination is allowed. I really want to emphasize this. Current California law prohibits curriculum from promoting political or religious doctrine. I'm not going to read the exact statute there. You can see what it says, but what it means is that the public school curriculum must be fact-based, not ideological. Teachers and materials may not promote or normalize, and I'll skip religious because that's obvious, but relevant to ethnic studies is political ideology, such as Marxism, liberationalism, anti-Zionism, framed as doctrine, for example.
Yep.
Instruction must reflect professional standards and not partisan advocacy. Again, this exists in law now. The question is, what are we doing to prevent that from bleeding into our classrooms? And here, and to Robert's point, ethnic studies becomes an entry point. It's not a solution. Ethnic studies is the problem, because ethnic studies is based in political ideologies based on exactly these prohibited mentions here. So again, I asked the question at the end, and I think we should all be asking this question. And if there are any legislators or staff, I hope you are watching this. The question is the current ethnic studies model curriculum compatible with the rest of the California Education Code? And I think the answer is no. And I hope that when we have our first policy committee hearing, that somebody asks that question of the proponents of the bill. Is the current model ethnic studies model curriculum compatible with the rest of the California Education Code?
Yeah.
Who knows? Let's find out. And Nicole, to your point earlier, you mentioned transparency. I really want to emphasize this: transparency already is the law. And again, I know, and Nicole, maybe you can touch on this, and I'll ask if you can please talk about your Public Records Act experience, because I know that and many of you watching this may have had bad experiences with Public Records Act requests, and schools dragging their feet, or schools or districts saying things like, the law requires curriculum and instructional materials. This is supportive material, or something that's not within exactly that framework.
Yeah.
Again, those are enforcement issues. They are not following the law. And the question is, to our state leaders, how many lawsuits do you expect us to file until the law will be enforced, when we have a constitutional officer in the Attorney General who has the power to certainly begin looking at this, as well as the Superintendent of Public Instruction? But maybe, Nicole, you can give a little bit more insight into your experience with public records requests.
Yes. Well, I can tell you in a word, or in 2 words, it's been really bad. So any school district, it is the law in California that every school district must provide full transparency to the curriculum and all of the instructional materials that are being used in the classrooms. And by the way, that is not just if you are a parent in the school district, that is for anybody. If this is a public school district, anybody who lives within the district zip code is entitled to see the materials. That is taxpayer bought and paid for content that should be visible to all. When you try to ask for it, you will get one of 3 things will happen. One is they will say, oh, sure, here it is. And then they'll send you to a web page that has a description of English lit for 9th grade, which doesn't tell you anything about the actual materials that are being used. They tell you that you must fill out a form and submit it, and then they'll give it to you. And then it'll come back to you, and they'll say, well, you didn't fill out the form correctly, or you're missing some information, and we can't give it to you. Or they will say, this was the best actually that we've heard, is that this content is actually there's a copyright on this, and we are not allowed to release it to you. That actually really caught, I think, a lot of parents off guard, because that was a way to work around the transparency issue. When you have a school principal or a district that does not want to show you what they are teaching to your children, that in and of itself makes everything else that they do come under suspicion. If you are not doing anything wrong and you are proud of the content and the material and the education that you're providing for the community, you would be proud to show it, to have it on the website, to have links everywhere. Every newsletter that goes out to parents should have the link back to the curriculum. That has actually never happened. So when I've submitted, requests, I've gotten all of these, responses. I also recently had a really pretty horrible experience in my own school district, where we did go through the process of approving an ethnic studies curriculum. It was, we thought we were gearing up for the mandate to be funded. And so we went through the whole process. And during one of the sessions, I asked a question about the quality level. I felt like the material was more 5th grade level than 9th grade level. And I was worried that, this was supposed to be a 9th grade class. And also I thought the material was rather divisive. There were teachers and teacher union reps at this public community here, feedback session, and they stood up and started screaming at me and yelling at me that I was a racist and that I didn't know anything about curriculum, and the teachers work very hard, and how dare I ask these questions. And again, I simply asked, well, why is this worksheet that we're seeing here? It says, how does the poem, how does it make you feel? And it had a bunch of smiley faces on it. And the students were supposed to pick which smiley face best described how they felt about the material. And this was supposed to be 9th grade English lit. So you get one of those reactions. You get stonewalled. You get something that doesn't tell you anything actually at all. You get told that you've missed, the comma, or something is in the wrong place, and so that you have to do it again, and then it gets lost. In the case that I had with this harassment and bullying, I actually submitted a complaint to the district. They brought me in to do an interview because it was a employee of the district, and they said they'll be doing a full investigation, which, by the way, is also in the Ed Code. If you submit a complaint, there has to be a full investigation, and then it has to be a full report that is then provided to the person who has submitted the complaint. And I submitted my complaint in September, and I have still not heard back. That is more than 6 months, and they are supposed to provide me with a written report within 60 days. So all of that is to say that the transparency is there, the laws are there, all the rules and regulations are there. What is not happening is the districts following the rules and the laws. And the double speak and the runaround is done sometimes with smiles, sometimes not. But it's the same as if you go to the website and you try to click on something and it brings you to 5 other pages that click back into the first page, and then you end up going around in circles. So I do think there was one case in California where a parent was charged like $30,000 or something for public records request. She wanted materials, and they said it cost a lot to print all that up or something, and so they charged her all this money. There's a lawsuit. I'll have to look it up, but that's what happens. And so again, if they're not showing you what they're teaching your children, red flag. If they give you the runaround, red flag. If they, send you a link that's a broken link and say that's where everything is. By the way, that also happened. Everything's up on the website. All the curriculum's on the website. You go onto the website, none of the links work. They're all broken links. So,
by the way, what you just described happened to board members or elected trustees of school boards who were supposed to vote on these materials in their school board meetings, and they went the night before, whatever, because it was an emergency meeting. They only had 24 hours notice, whatever. Yeah. And there's no links.
And there's nothing there. And again, when they say here's the curriculum, for a school board member, for example, who's supposed to be voting to approve it or to not approve it, and here's a curriculum, and what it is one piece of paper that is, printed only halfway down, that really just has a description of what 9th grade English is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they're supposed to approve it. And again, some of those school board members who said, look, you want me to vote on this, but I don't know what it is. So can you give me the material? Same thing happens. They are yelled at, they're screamed at, they're, how do you not trust our teachers? I would love to trust the teachers, but I haven't seen anything that they've produced. So show me what they've produced so I can read it, and then I will vote on it. And so it's the same sort of runaround, that they get anybody who's asking for any kind of visibility or transparency into what it is that they are teaching in the classrooms.
I also want to mention, I didn't mention it previously with 1468, but with you, I lost my train of thought. Sorry. No, I lost it. All right, so we'll carry on here. Where are we? Transparency is already the law, right? Okay. California parents already have legal rights to know what their children are being taught. Again, enforcement and not access. I know what it was I wanted to mention. Sorry, guys. I told you it was a long presentation. AB 1468 is meant to create content standards and frameworks for ethnic studies. Now, and I know I've said that many times. We all know what that. We've all heard those words before. One of my fundamental questions is, and again, this goes to the point of access to instructional materials, curriculum, textbooks, so on and so forth. What does an ethnic studies content standard look like? To me, I think it is incredibly problematic that we are jumping headfirst into a law that would require the establishment of this standard and framework in a discipline that we can't even agree on what it means or how it's defined. And that, to me, is incredibly problematic. Again, if there is something that is being taught or that needs to be taught within the multicultural framework, or we want to emphasize certain histories, or again, if people are familiar with education policy and content, to Nicole's point, high schools in California, as far as I am aware, history stops after World War II. Our kids are not taught, really, as far as I understand it, beyond an ethnic studies course, civil rights and all that kind of stuff. The more contemporary modern history is not taught, as far as I understand. But
Well, I mean, world history isn't taught until 11th grade.
world
And
history is important, right?
yeah, and so, but also, the vast majority of the school districts that have either already implemented ethnic studies or were
Yep.
planning to implement ethnic studies for this, this coming fall in preparation for what would have been AB 101, but now potentially isn't, but maybe would be. It's very confusing. They are planning to do the ethnic studies courses in ninth grade. So you've got students coming in who they're actually not taking a history class in ninth grade because it's not required. And but they haven't taken world history really yet. And they're going to be put in front of a lot of this content and material that we as parents are not even allowed to see what it is, that school board members aren't allowed to see what it is, but they're supposed to be voting on it. And all of this is supposed to be happening to our children. And we're supposed to trust that the people who are giving us the runaround are also going to be making sure that there's no bad stuff, but they don't have an enforcement mechanism to assure us that that is actually the case. And so again, I'm really not sure how this is going to solve those problems when the transparency issues and the
Yeah.
the oversight into the content that's being taught, those were issues that we had way before 101 even was a thing, right?
Yeah.
So that all of these issues actually predate it. These ed codes predate 2020. All right.
Yep.
Why wasn't this being done before? Who did the huge research on all of our content that said that in history classes we weren't teaching real history?
Nobody.
I want to
Nobody.
know because
Yeah.
I want to fix that. I want to teach real history.
Yeah.
But none of these questions were answered. I mean, this is a political issue. It's not an education issue. And this is something I say all the time, that people keep thinking that we can solve this with education or with, the content standards. Well, we're not following content standards in any of the other subjects. Why would we follow it for this? Again, any of the educators in school districts that are going to do things by the book would do it anyway by the book.
Right. Right. They'd be doing it now by the book. We wouldn't be talking about this.
100%. So,
And, and again, I really want to reiterate too, like I'm genuinely curious what an ethnic studies standard looks like. And if proponents of this legislation really want to solve the issue, did you request a report from the Department of Education on gaps in the districts that districts are complaining about with regard to this? If so, where is that report? And where is the report that shows what give us a draft ethnic studies standard?
yeah.
Or set of standards. And again, if it looks like multicultural education, cool. We don't need to pass a new law. We already have that on the books. Maybe it needs to be expanded. But that's the conversation we should be having right now. And the fact that we've jumped headfirst into something that, again, is so controversial, people can't even agree on what the definition of ethnic studies is. And now we want to create content standards and frameworks. There should be a lot more study and deliberative work done prior to passage or even consideration of legislation as drastic as 1468.
Yeah.
So again, what are the real solutions? As I said, and as Nicole reiterated, enforcement is an issue. Oversight is an issue. So here are two things that we should be asking for. Number one is immediate enforcement and oversight. There is nothing stopping the Attorney General and the Department of Education right now from establishing a joint task force, from conducting a survey of districts, looking to see where the major complaints are coming in through the UCP, the Uniform Complaint Process procedure. So right now, this is what we should be asking for. And I have to say that after 10/7, and again, this is primarily a Jewish audience or Israeli audience, after 10/7, the problems that we were complaining about prior to 10/7 just increased by a factor of 10. Things just got way worse of course, after 10/7, a lot of the activism that we saw on college campuses were coming into our classrooms, and in fact, a lot of it was coming from the teachers themselves, as you saw in the video that we highlighted about UTLA last fall.
Right.
So what we should be doing is focusing on enforcing these laws now. There should be oversight hearings now. And I'm disappointed that last year, when it was 2918, again, 2019 was a legislative solution. There was a gut and amend, what's called in legislative process, a gut and amend procedure. That's a very, again, dramatic process, legislative tool that you use really as a last resort with permission from leadership to waive rules, et cetera, et cetera. Very dramatic proposal. The homework wasn't done. Coalitions were not built in advance. And I had hoped that proponents of wanting to fix ethnic studies would have done the work between July of 2024 and now it is April of 2025. But that didn't happen, unfortunately. And so now my frustration is, here we are again, spinning our wheels. There's been no oversight and no obvious enforcement aside from the Attorney General's legal note. And that's, to me, unacceptable. And in fact, it's a problem because, again, I mentioned two pieces of legislation. I'd like to go into both of them now a little bit further, because there are issues within our education system that need to be addressed with regard to compliance and other enforcement issues. Again, I already mentioned SB 14. Again, I believe it was SB 1421. That was from Henry Stern last year in 2024. This would have established an Office of Civil Rights to focus on and to report on complaints that are coming from the district from parents and students. Again, that bill did not make it out of the Senate Appropriations Committee last session. This year, we have a bill called AB 84, which is actually sponsored by Al Marisucci. Al Marisucci, or Assemblymember Marisucci, is the chair of the Assembly Education Committee. So this is a major bill, and I want to be very specific. So it's not on the screen, but I'm going to tell you that it's important to recognize that the bill does establish an Office of Inspector General within the Department of Education to perform fiscal and compliance audits across the state of California and throughout the CDE, Department of Education. However, and this is a big however, the rest of that bill is very hostile to charter schools. So what the assembly did, or what this assembly member, this bill sponsor did, was he put a great piece of policy in the establishment of the OIG, or the Office of Inspector General, within the Department of Education, but he wrapped it with a lot of policy that is frankly hostile to the operations of charter schools. And I think that that's certainly a strategy and tactic in legislative process to put things together like that. We as an organization are deciding how we'll approach this. I think, of course, we'll support the Inspector General concept, but ask for the other elements to be either eliminated or tamped down. But I think it's obvious that when the chair of the Assembly Education Committee has a bill that would establish an Office of Inspector General within the Department of Education, we all know there's problems within school districts. Now, those of you who are really in the know and who know this particular assembly member and where he's from probably recognize that this bill is in response to the issues at San Francisco Unified and their fiscal problems, because what this bill is looking at is a lot of the financial components of the operations of school districts. But there are compliance requirements there as well for non-fiscal matters. So I think that's important. I raise these issues not to say that you should support AB 84, because again, you have to look at the entire bill. And by the way, the bill, I think, is, if I remember correctly, is 114 pages long. So you can get through that. But we look at these bills like 1421 and like AB 84 to know that there are other ways beyond even 1468 to address some of the issues. And I hope that others are looking at to see what other education-related proposals the assembly members are making. We are certainly making those or doing that research now to get that answer.
Can I just, as you're, I guess, looking into this one, as soon as you said that that office would be created within the Department of Education, you sort of lost me,
Yeah.
because I don't actually think that it belongs there. It's like you can't. I don't. I think it should be maybe in the appropriations, or the fine, something where like, you can't have the same people who are creating the mess investigating the mess. I don't agree with sort of that, I guess, placement of it. I certainly, I mean, I didn't know anything about this bill, but I don't think that, again, and I don't know if this is another negotiating tactic where you're going to, put something really horrible about limiting charter schools. Charter schools are the only schools that are actually producing really good academic success, because they're held to a standard, whereas other public school districts are not. And so you've got like an enormous amount of money being spent in public school districts per student. And the vast majority, it's like 72% of California's fourth graders and eighth graders are not reading at grade level. But it's the charter schools where they are, in fact, achieving that academic success. Those are the ones then that are going to be clamped down on. So like, I feel like, again, the bill maybe has good intentions, but it's so convoluted and wrapped up in some of these problems. Like, I just don't think that a bill that's supposed to be having oversight over this area should have these people monitoring and having the oversight. It just feels like I don't know.
So,
This is, I guess, is what makes the legislative process so hard, is these negotiating tactics. And maybe it was done on purpose, and maybe his intent, again, I don't know what his intent is, but like, move it somewhere else. Somewhere you can't have the same department creating the mess with oversight and then investigating it. And by the way, I think this is something I have actual experience with, because in my school district, we did manage to get an ombudsman role created that's supposed to be, taking in complaints and doing it in a way that really is the voice of the parents and the students who are filing the complaints, so that there's not any anything that comes back against them from the principal or at the school site. And guess what? That is the person who I submitted my complaint to. I haven't heard from since September. So did not work out well.
Yeah. So look, I mean, that's an ombudsman or an ombudsperson is a great, for people who don't know that term, it's a kind of a liaison or an external affairs type position, but it's meant to be very helpful and that kind of thing. So that's a great idea. It's a shame that it's not working in our district.
Well, she's hired by the district, and my complaint is about the district. And so when I submit a complaint about teachers and professionals in the district to a person who's works for the district, I mean, I don't know what I expected, but
and I mean, technically, an ombudsperson is supposed to be independent, and they're hired to be independent. But again, in that case, it's hard to be independent. In this case of the Office of Inspector General, this person actually is, and I should be more specific about it if I'm going to bring it up. This legislative proposal says that the person is appointed by the governor, but confirmed by the state Senate. So it's technically responsive to the legislature, not necessarily to the department itself. That being said, it's all part of the same thing. It's all part of the same package of officials. And by the way, to your point, you mentioned appropriations or some other committees in the legislature. Again, the education committees have jurisdiction now to perform oversight. They can do that right now. We don't need a law. We don't need anything. They could raise their hand tomorrow and say, I want to have a oversight
but
hearing.
They won't.
Right. Well, and that's our fault. That's our fault, frankly, right? We have to choose people who are either going to be responsive to us or push that, or whatever. But for some reason, they have to be responsive to their electorate. And by the way, the genius thing is, what is the Jewish community focusing on right now? They're not focused on, hey, let's have oversight. They're focused on, let's do 1468 because it's going to solve the problem, because that's what they've been told. So the legislators have been smart in this specific instance of pointing a shiny object or waving a shiny object and saying, hey, look at this as the solution. And we're not asking for actual oversight. And by the way, the major provisions of 1468 don't come online until most of the current Jewish caucus are already termed out. So the people that we do trust there, and there are several members of the Jewish caucus I personally trust, they'll be gone by the time that the major provisions of this bill come into place. And I don't know who will be there. They'll have no institutional memory. Policy will be forgotten. People will forget that we even complained about this by then.
Well, what's going to happen is that we're going to start all over again.
Yeah,
again.
Exactly.
For the third
Exactly.
time.
Exactly. All right, but we're not gonna do that, right?
Right.
So, all right. So let's wrap this up. We're almost done, guys. A couple more slides. Legislative process. This is a super simple legislative process chart for you. Again, you can take a screenshot of this. These are important dates. Let's go through the left side of the screen first. You have, in this case, the bill has started in the Assembly. It starts in what's called the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee decides where the bill goes based on the substance of the legislation. In this case, it's an education bill. It'll go to the Education Committee. That's called a policy committee. A policy committee evaluates the substantive policy of the bill and not the financial aspect or the fiscal component of the bill. So the policy committees will look at the substance of legislation and they'll decide yay or nay based on, again, that substance. If the bill passes that policy committee, it then goes to what's called the appropriations or the fiscal committee. The fiscal committee will evaluate the cost of the bill. There will be a fiscal analysis that will be attached to the bill, and that will be part of the overall assessment during that committee. Depending on the cost of the bill and how it's scored or evaluated, the bill could go to what's called a suspense file. A suspense file or the suspense file in the Appropriations Committee is basically where usually bills go to die, frankly. But I've had a piece of legislation, or have had several pieces come out of suspense, so it's not impossible. But typically they go there to die. Usually, by the time we get to this part of the process, we know if this fiscal impact will be considered or it fits within the realm of the budget, and so it should pass through easily in that way. But with this bill in particular, we don't know if that's the case. We'll have to see. I think there's a lot of questions around that. Once it passes out of appropriations, it goes to the floor, repeats the same process in the Senate. You should be aware that substantively the bill can be changed very significantly between the two chambers. I've had legislation that looked one way when it came out of the Assembly, and it looked completely different by the time we got to the first policy committee in the Senate. Thank God, because it was torn apart and put back. It was torn apart and put back together again. And then, of course, once it passes out of the Senate, in that case I just gave you, it had to go back to the Assembly for concurrence. Once the two chambers agree, this is the Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law deal, by the way, real quick. So the bill then goes to the governor, who can then sign it into law or veto it. To the right side of your screen, these are critical dates. So May 2nd is the last day for the policy committee to report the bill out of the Assembly. So again, on the Assembly side, May 2nd is the deadline for the bill to get out of that committee. May 23rd is the last day for it to get out of the Appropriations Committee, and it has to pass the floor of the Assembly by June 6th. Then it goes over to if it gets this far, then it goes to the Senate. It goes through the same process, and once again, July 18th is the last day for it to get out of Senate education. August is the August 29th is last day for fiscal, and then September 12th is last day for final passage to get it off of the Senate floor, and then over to the governor. And then there's a 30-day period where the governor has to sign or veto. So
you definitely have to put this out onto your website, because and some of the other slides as well, maybe the whole presentation, because I think that, a lot of this stuff, this is stuff that's very, very detailed. And, even if you had a screenshot, I think people just being able to see this on your website would be great. I don't know. I would be very surprised if we get, all the way to the summer with this, with how strongly the teacher unions are coming out against this bill. Again, they're really not into the transparency piece of it, and shocking. But still, I think it would be great for people to have access to that.
So we'll make that presentation available. And again, to everybody who signed up, we'll send you an email and thank you for signing up and participating. So on the screen now is, again, I don't, this has been a way long presentation. I don't want to go too much further into substance at this late hour. But there's a QR code on your screen. You can scan that and go right to the action page for 1468. Again, we are opposing the current a model of the bill for the reasons explained in this presentation, and we're demanding oversight and enforcement of existing laws. Again, I think there are some amendments you can make to the current legislation to increase some transparency, but we shall see. So shall I go through Q&A? And I see Isaac already has one.
Yeah, I think this one was, this was, aside from the removal of the 4 core groups, what do you anticipate?
So this bill is structured in a very interesting way, in that you have aspects and elements that people who are concerned about ethnic studies really like the transparency requirements, the reporting, which again, I think 5 years is too long. You could maybe play with that number, make it 3 years, whatever. Things you could play with things like that. And that would be from our side, those of us who want transparency and those who are happy with that kind of reporting requirement. That being said, I think that there's another side, and again, there are many sides of this bill, some opposed and some in support. Many sides, just not 2 sides, but there are many sides. The other side, who also oppose the bill, like us, and we'll say the teachers' unions in this case, probably do not like those reporting and transparency requirements. They would probably see it as an undue burden on teachers, undue burden on instructors, and a level of transparency that, frankly, already exists in law and creates additional confusion or whatever. And I'm being generous in my assertion of what I think their position could be. And this is just, I'm just supposing what their position would be. But I would imagine that they would want that out. The standards component is interesting. I think that the word standards and framework are misleading to our community, to those who are concerned about ethnic studies, because it seems like supercharged guardrails, right? It seems like like ultra mega guardrails. And again, I have to emphasize that it's an expansion of ethnic studies in a way that is concerning and dangerous. So I don't know where the teachers' unions or others would fall on standards. I actually think the issue of standards is very interesting, also because there are states that have tried. There are other states, and by the way, I spoke to bill proponents, to the bill authors, I should say, and our one bill author who happens to be my assembly member, Rick Sabur, and I asked him, did you look to see if there are other states that have passed standards? And he said no, but of course there are states like Minnesota, for example, that have gone through the process of creating ethnic studies standards. Now, they did it within their history and social studies framework, or the history and social studies core areas, but they were still problematic, and now there's actually an effort to repeal those standards. And again, I think
forward very significantly. I mean, it's very interesting to see that. We think here in California that we were the first ones for sure, but there are other states. I mean, Minnesota. The problem was that the content standards that was going to elevate ethnic studies into the same level of importance as math and English and science were so bad that in Minnesota, which is arguably, I would say, more Democrat and progressive than California, it did not go over well. And I think that repeal movement, it passed. And so I think it's gone in now to like the final stage, whatever that is, but they were not letting the content standards pass in the Minnesota state legislature. So.
And before someone fact checks, I'm not sure if it passed. I don't know if it passed. We'll have to check, but it's certainly being considered. And again,
before they should do it again.
but But again, we should look to see what other states have done and what mistakes they have made. And if we need to see what a draft looks like before we say, hey, give me this, I think that's not an unreasonable thing to ask. So I'm curious to see where the content standards go. I happen to think they're very toxic. And by the way, the liberated ethnic studies folks, or extremists, I should call them, they are opposed to this bill as well. They seem to be opposed to the content standards too. I'm not sure why. And there's part of me that maybe that a naive, optimistic part of me wants to think that maybe they realize that an ethnic studies set of standards and a framework will blow their cover. Because once you go down that path and see what ethnic studies really is and how different it is from multicultural education and history and social science or social studies, you go, whoa, whoa, whoa! This is not what we asked for, and it almost forces you to take a step back. Whereas now, ethnic studies is in this nice little gray area where we don't see content standards that are extremist, but we also say that history and social studies is insufficient. So there's this gray area. So I think they're happy in that gray area. But what we need to do is say, hey, again, enforcement of existing law will clear up that gray area more so than these content standards would. So again, with amendments related to content standards, I'm not too sure. I expect transparency to be challenged. And I expect, I hear that the advisory council has been removed, but we'll have to see it when it comes to the first, if it gets to the first committee, we'll have to see it then.
Well, that actually goes into this question.
Who from the state will review and judge the vast questions of district curriculum submittals? And what is the consequence if the curricula violates requirements? So I think, again, these are questions that we don't necessarily know the answer to. As far as I understand now, with the 1468 legislative language simply says that the California Department of Education has to take a sampling of districts across the state and produce a report every 5 years. The district can decide what that sampling mechanism is, but it has to produce that report every 5 years. And so it's unclear to me, or I think even legislators, how CDE would implement that or fulfill that requirement. And then in terms of the consequences, again, the legislation doesn't specify consequences, but adherence would have to be the requirement. If the state and the district got into an argument over compliance, the state can always take the district to court if it's not complying. So that's an option. I will say that there has been chatter, and this is like a secret little bonus that we've been given in a budget bill. I have heard, I've seen the language around Assemblymember Gabriel's proposal to add fines to districts who are not in compliance with this. Again, I mean, that's fine, but these are powers and authorities that the superintendent has the right to look to see now what the districts are doing. Maybe he doesn't have the right to issue a fine. I don't think the superintendent is interested in issuing fines. I think I hope he's interested in compliance, and should use his existing tools to do that. So these are questions, Kim. That's the best I can answer it. It's unclear now how that would be implemented.
So this question is about alternative curriculum to ethnic studies. This is one I've actually dealt with quite a lot, so I'm going to jump in real quick. So with regards to ACES, the Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, again, anything that ACES is going to put out is going to be what we would all consider history, good history, real history. And so if you can get something from ACES into your school district, though again, it kind of depends on if your school district specifically has ethnic studies as a mandate for graduation in the district, which there are school districts in California that have mandated it just in their school district, regardless of what's going on at the state level. And so if you have one of those districts you are able to get your district to use curriculum from ACES, yes, great, excellent. The problem is that even if you were able to take this and get it into the hands of the people who make decisions on curriculum, they are likely not going to adopt an external curriculum from a solid, reputable organization like ACES, because they have people inside of their districts who are either aligned with liberated ethnic studies through their teacher union or other organizations like RA, the Association for Raza Educators. So yeah, it's a great alternative if you have to have one. Getting it actually used in the district is something, it's a whole other story. So, again, anything from ACES is going to be what all of us here probably would consider to be real history and, solid, good content. Whether the district powers that be agree, that remains to be seen.
Yep. All right. Any others?
Yeah, actually, this is interesting.
Perfect. What are the risks of not passing? I think that's an incredibly important question. Again, some people would argue that the risk of not passing 1468 is that it allows for ethnic studies to be taught in this kind of wild, wild west freewheeling fashion. And again, I think that the Attorney General's note shows that from a legal perspective that is not the case. And while that note does highlight enforcement issues, 1468 doesn't provide any new enforcement tools. It provides a mandatory oversight requirement for the CDE to report every 5 years, but the other guardrails that are there are simply reiterations of existing law, and it doesn't do anything positive. Now, I would actually say that there is greater risk in actually passing 1468 because of the standards component being the biggest danger. But I would say that if we want to go back to multicultural education, if that's what we truly want, then we have a beautiful framework under the establishment of the Fair Education Act through SB 48 back in 2011. And thank God we have the main sponsor, Rick Sabur, who at the time was he sponsors 1468. He's also he was the sponsor then in a non-legislative capacity. So I think the risks are I don't think there are any risks of not passing 1468. I think the risks lie in actually passing it and implementing those content standards.
Yeah, there's one risk. Sorry.
Well, I do want to say though that again, we've all been distracted by legislation. The main risk of not passing 1468 falls on us because we need to say, hey, where's the enforcement? Where's the oversight now? And we can't say, oh, 1468 didn't pass, so we throw up our hands because now we have no tools. That's probably the biggest risk of not passing 1468 is that we think our ability to respond to these issues has been taken away when that's not the case. So that's what I would say is the biggest risk, actually. Sorry, Nicole, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's another risk that not very many people sort of have on their radar, a risk of passing 1468. And, I think this goes back to, Robert's question earlier. We have a parallel situation happening at the UC system and the CU system, or California State system. And that is that there has been, in parallel to ethnic studies being a mandate for graduation in high schools here in California, there has been another path that seeks to make ethnic studies a requirement for admissions to the UC system and to CSU. Currently, it is a graduation requirement at Cal State. Okay, so you do have to, if you go to Cal State, no matter what major you are, you do need to take one course of ethnic studies in order to graduate, but it's not an admissions requirement. And you have the regents there at UC sort of fighting this battle in an ongoing way over the last, I don't even know, 10 years even. And and they've been able to push back and not make this an admissions requirement. If it becomes an admissions requirement at the UC system, that means that it is a requirement not only for California students, it's for any student who wants to apply for admissions to a UC school would have to take ethnic studies. Now, they've been able to keep this at bay, much to their credit, and this is not passed as an admissions requirement. What happens if the California state legislature puts ethnic studies in a legitimate, position, the same level as all of the other A through G admissions requirements, math, science, history, English, etc.? What argument are the UC regents going to have for not making it an admissions requirement at that point? I would say they don't, and they won't be able to argue against it. And worse, I don't really think the Jewish community is going to be able to argue against it either if our community is the one supporting this and pushing it. And I really hate to have to say that. I don't want to say that, but it is a huge concern because once it goes in as an admissions requirement to UC, that's it. The long march through the institutions, starting with the education institution, has been completed. Yep. And all of the other systems, state school systems in the country, will then fall as well. And so I think that this really is sort of a hill to die on because we cannot afford to let that happen. And those UC regents who have been fighting back against this, we need to support them in continuing to fight back on this. And by the way, those are elected offices as well. So we want to make sure that they can keep their seats and keep the good fight at that level. So again, I think this is all of the issues it was trying to solve, maybe in good, with intent. I just see this as creating more and more issues, more and more problems, more money than I think we even can anticipate being needed for all of this to occur. And at the same time, we've got more than 70% of our fourth graders and eighth graders can't read at grade level. And that's just not acceptable to me. So I think I would much rather have our entire Jewish caucus focused on oversight, on enforcing existing laws and ed codes and protections. I do love the idea of an Office of Civil Rights at the California state level. I just don't want it under the Department of Education. Right. I would like it under, again, some other department so that you have actual oversight. That would be my preference. So I know we went way over, and I think that covers the questions for tonight.
All right. Excellent. So let's let me see if I can get out of this presentation here, and we can do like that. All right. We can say goodnight. So thank you, first of all, Nicole, for joining me on this 2-hour long webinar on ethnic studies and for hanging out the entire time.
We can talk about this all day long, can't we?
Oh, and honestly, we didn't touch on every single aspect. I mean, these were like the core key aspects that I really wanted the community to follow and understand. And frankly, to understand why ICANN is opposed to the current version of the bill, because I think there's a lot of confusion about that, or some confusion. So hopefully that clarified things. And hopefully it clarified why you too should be opposed. Those of you watching should be opposed to the bill as well, and should be pushing for changes, if not an outright withdrawal of the legislation. So and if you want to give any last comments, Nicole?
I want to thank everyone for sticking it out. It is a lot to cover, but all of these questions, again, the more questions come up, the more I think people realize that we're really not going to be solving anything with this. And we might even be creating additional problems that we are not going to be able to get out of so easily. I would say that I encourage everybody to report any and all incidents or issues or complaints that you have to your district and keep a written record of it, because I do think that we should start sending our complaints up to the state legislature and to our elected officials in Sacramento. I think they do need to hear from us, especially around these issues. We're not getting the oversight. Parents are given the runaround. we're asked to, we want to be included in this process, and we are being cut out by the districts, and that needs to be dealt with. So I encourage everyone to continue to submit those complaints, and hopefully we can meet up again on more exciting and positive bills, and go through the whole process with something that really is going to help bring California back up to solid education outcomes that we can all be proud of.
I concur.
Amen to that.
Couldn't agree more. All right. So again, everybody, thank you for hanging out with us for 2 hours to talk about Assembly Bill 1468 and the history of ethnic studies. I want to wish you a Laila Tov and a good night, and we will see you soon. Please take action regarding this bill. Thank you so much. Stand